don't know what your norm is about speakers being masked.
It's okay.
Okay, not to be.
It's okay to take it off.
Okay.
Whatever you want.
I just find you might hear me better. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Maureen. It's nice to be here. I was scheduled to be here in early March 2020 to give this talk, maybe not this exact talk, but a talk. And I think it was I was sort of worried about this virus I was hearing about, and should I travel? And I ended up canceling. So I'm glad to be back. Entirely on the other side of this thing, but at least in traveling in in-person mode again. I also want to just say I'm very sad that Sarah McClanahan isn't here. She was incredibly helpful and warm to me early in my career, and was a great colleague. And I'm very sad and that she's not here anymore. So it's sort of bittersweet to be here and not be able to visit with her, as I know it is for all of you as well. I'm going to talk today. I changed the title a little bit from what was advertised, but I'm going to talk today about this paper that I've been doing with some colleagues and students, looking at consequences of school segregation on academic achievement. Let's see here. How do I go down slides? There we go. So I'll start briefly with a little background on what we know about the consequences of court-ordered desegregation in the 60s and 70s, basically just recapping some work by Rucker Johnson on this, and then talk about what I'm going to do to estimate the effects of segregation today and how we're going to try to understand how segregation operates. So if you haven't read Rucker Johnson's book, I recommend it to you if you're interested in segregation, Children of the Dream. What Rucker did was he took PSID data and he looks at the long-term outcomes of children who grew up in the South in the 60s and 70s. Some of those children were born in places that desegregated earlier than others. And so for kids born at the same time, but in different places, some experienced more time in desegregated schools or less time in desegregated schools. Some were born in the same place, but at different times. So siblings, for example, or kids in the same community. And so lived in the same place or even in the same family, but because of being born at different times, experienced more or less time in desegregated schools. So he leverages that variation across place and across cohorts, driven by the inconsistent timing of desegregation orders, to see what the effects of attending desegregated schools were, both for Black students and white students. And so using PSID data, he has large samples of kids born at different times and in different places in the South. And court orders, desegregation sort of started in the 60s in the South, really started in earnest around 68, and stopped in the early to mid 70s in terms of when it really began. I mean, when the orders took place, obviously desegregation continued after that. And so he has a lot of figures in his book and his work that look like this. Essentially, read this as when did a child turn 18, or when should they have graduated from high school relative to the court order? So if they turned 18 in the year of the court order, they experienced none of their schooling career in desegregated schools. If they turned 18 13 years after the court order, then they experienced all 13 years of their K-12 time in desegregated schools. And if they're born sort of somewhere in the middle, they experience. And so you have a kind of a dose response model. And so he's, for kids born before the court order, and then with different numbers of years of experience of desegregated schools, to the end, he creates figures that look like this essentially. And so this is looking at effects on educational attainment by race. And you can see white students experience no change in average educational attainment. Black students experience an increase of 1.5 years of educational attainment if they got the sort of full dose of 12 or 13 years of desegregated schools. Likelihood of graduating from high school, not surprisingly, shows the same patterns. It's related to educational attainment. A 30% or so increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school. For Black students, no difference for white students. Increase in adult wages of 30%. Reduction of poverty by about 25%. Likelihood of being incarcerated also down by 20+% for Blacks. Again, none of these show an effect for whites. Adult health status is better for those attending desegregated schools. And even the children, the next generation, has better educational outcomes if their parents went to desegregated schools for Black students. Again, no real difference for white students. So I think Rutgers' work is the best evidence we have on the long-term effects of desegregation of schools in the South in the 60s and 70s. Rutgers' work then sort of says what drove this, and his argument is that it's largely about the change in school funding in the South. So Southern states ran two separate systems of education prior to desegregation. One very poorly funded system for Blacks, and one less poorly funded system for whites. I won't say well-funded. And when they were forced to integrate those systems, what most states did was raise the overall per pupil amounts so that the funding kind of came up to the level that it had been for the white system for everyone. That is, rather than sort of lower the average funding for whites and raise it for Blacks, they raised it, not to a very high level. Many Southern states still don't fund their school systems at very high levels. But what it amounted to was an increase in the average funding of the schools attended by Black students relative to those attended by white students. And it changed racial segregation patterns. So this figure shows how much the experience of racial segregation changed. Obviously, it went down as a result of desegregation. And this shows the effect on school spending for Blacks. So spending on Blacks is pretty flat. And then the more years they spent in desegregated schools, the higher the average per pupil funding was, by about 20% increase. And so Rutgers' argument is that a lot of the effect of desegregation is driven by the increased funding that came along with it in the South. The Supreme Court's argument in Brown was that the reason segregation is bad is because it gives the legal imprimatur to segregation, that it was de jure segregation was harmful because it encoded in law the belief that Black children were inferior to white children. And so by publicly sort of saying that created psychological harm. So if either of those is the main mechanism by which segregation operates, it's not clear that segregation will have the same effects today, because segregation today is not de jure, it's de facto. That is, it's not required by law, but it happens as a result of lots of other structural forces. And school funding is much more equal today than it was between the Black and white systems of schooling in the South. In most states today have equalized their funding formulas so that the average school of a Black student and the average school of a white student in the same state have relatively equal funding. Sometimes actually the average school of a Black student has a little bit more funding, sometimes a little bit less, but in most states the disparity is not particularly large and nowhere on the order of magnitude it was in the South. So if it's school funding that drives the effects of segregation or that drove it in the past, it's not clear segregation matters today in the same way it did before. And if it's the legal imprimatur of segregation that the court was worried about, then it's not clear that is a mechanism that's active today anymore. So I think it's an open question. Does segregation of schools matter today? We know it mattered back then, but does it matter today? So that's what I want to kind of talk about. So first of all, has segregation changed much in recent decades? So this is a measure of kind of losing the top of this. Is there a way to hide this thing?
Yeah, it's because we're sharing it remotely on Zoom.
Yeah. All right. Well,
And
it says
they can get rid of the top part. I don't
up at the part, it says something about trends in segregation. Okay. So this is a measure of Black, white, and Hispanic white segregation from 1991 to 2020. And this is a national measure. This is sort of looking at segregation across the entire country. And so it says, the way to read this is say the average Black student attends a school that had 45 to 50% more minority students in it than the average white student in the country in 1991. So the average Black student, say, attends a school that's 75% Black and Hispanic, and the average white student attends a school that's 25% Black and Hispanic. So that's a very big difference in 1991. It's declined very modestly over the last 30 years by maybe 10%. So segregation at a national level is still very high, hasn't declined a whole lot. It's lower in some parts of the country than in others, but it's most of this, by the way, is driven by between district segregation. That is, about 2/3 of this is because Black and white students attend schools in different school districts, not because the schools within a district are segregated. About 1/3 of it is the within district segregation. So much of it is sort of larger residential patterns that school systems have little or no power to change. Even if every school district in the country rearranged all its students so that every school within the district had the same racial composition, segregation would only go down nationally by about 1/3. Okay, so it's important to sort of keep in mind how much of this is driven by residential patterns rather than by school assignment patterns. All right, so I'm going to do 3 things to try to answer this question of whether segregation matters today and why. So one way to think about whether segregation matters is to see that it's sort of asking whether neighborhoods or schools affect kids' opportunities. If neighborhoods or schools affect opportunities, then systematically sorting white and Black children into different schools means they end up having different opportunities and therefore different outcomes. And so the kind of question about whether school context matters is sort of part of the question about whether segregation matters. So what I'm going to do is take data for every school district in the country over the last decade and look at the relationship between the segregation among schools in that district and the achievement gap in that district and the growth in the achievement gap as when kids are in school. So it's important to think about this growth of the achievement gap as the more interesting outcome. So when kids get to kindergarten, the racial achievement gaps in literacy and numeracy and school readiness on many dimensions are already quite large as a result of differences in family resources and differences in access to high quality childcare or preschool, differences in neighborhood conditions. And so those gaps are already big at kindergarten. Well, we don't want to blame those gaps on the schools. And so to the extent that school segregation is correlated with unequal opportunities early in childhood, we're going to get a biased estimate of the effect of school segregation on achievement gaps because it's going to be confounded with stuff we haven't measured about disparities in opportunity early in childhood. But the extent to which the achievement gap between, say, Black and white students grows as they stay longer in a particular school system, that's more reflective of differences in opportunities available to Black and white children in their schooling years. And so much more related to schooling opportunities. And so we're going to look to see whether school achievement gaps grow faster in more segregated school districts, not just whether the gaps are larger, because whether they're larger is potentially confounded with a bunch of early childhood stuff that isn't going to be in our models. So first analysis is this cross-sectional analysis where we're going to look across 7,000 or 9,000 districts in the country and see what the relationship is between segregation and gaps. Second is we're going to track individual cohorts of kids as they progress from 3rd, 4th to 5th, 6th to 7th to 8th grade. And we're going to say in the years in which this cohort was more segregated relative to other years, did the gap grow faster in those years? And so we have 10 years of data, which is essentially 13 different cohorts that we can observe from those years. And so within a district, we have lots of cohorts that progress through time. And so we're going to have district fixed effects in those models. So these are sort of panel models where we're tracking individual cohorts across time and saying, in the years and grades when this cohort was more segregated than other years and grades in this district, did achievement gaps grow more than other grades and districts? So again, it's looking at the growth, but it's looking kind of within districts, partialing out all fixed district characteristics. And so it's arguably a better estimate than the cross-sectional models would be. And third, we're going to look in some exploratory analysis, try to see if we can explain the relationship we see between segregation and achievement gaps and the growth of achievement gaps based on observable characteristics about school districts and the ways that the schools of Black and white or Hispanic and white children differ. That's going to be much more exploratory than the first two, which are trying to get closer to a reasonable causal estimate. I want to sort of say something about three different ways to think about segregation, or three different dimensions of it that are relevant here. So one is racial segregation per se. That's the extent to which students of different races are sorted into different schools. The second is economic segregation per se, which is the extent to which poor and non-poor kids are sorted into different schools. And the third is the intersection of those two, what we call racial economic segregation. It's the extent to which, say, Black and white students are concentrated in schools with different levels of poor students. And so one way to think about that is to look at this picture. So this is a kind of a bins, I don't know what to call this kind of a plot. Anyway, it's a plot where the x-axis is school percent minority in 10 bins, and the vertical axis is percent free and reduced lunch eligible in 10 bins. The size of these circles is the number of schools in the country that fall into that. So you can see there's lots of schools which have very few minority students and are relatively low poverty. There are some that are high poverty. There's a lot of very high minority, high poverty schools. There's very few high minority, low poverty schools. There's sort of you can see a kind of a correlation there. So racial segregation is the extent to which some schools are over there and some schools are over here, the extent to which there's variation in the racial composition of schools. Economic segregation is essentially a measure of whether there's variation in the vertical dimension, different free lunch proportion. And racial economic segregation is a measure of the correlation between those two. So you can see most Black students are in schools over here that have high proportions of free lunch eligibility. Most white students are in schools with lower. So that's reflective of what we call racial economic segregation. So the distinction here is going to become important in the analysis later, the difference between racial segregation per se and racial economic segregation. If there are clarifying questions, ask, but we'll hold like substantive questions for the end. All right, so the data, a little bit of background on the data. So the data comes from this big data set that I and my colleagues built, the Stanford Education Data Archive. You can download it at our website at opportunity.org. Basically, we take the test score data from all kids in public schools from 2009 through 2018. Federal law requires that every kid in 3rd through 8th grade be tested annually in math and reading. And so we have every kid in public school for those 10 years, their test scores in math and reading. The tests that are given aren't the same in different states. They're not the same in different grades, and they're not the same always across time. So we do a kind of a big linking enterprise to put all those test scores from different states, grades, years on the same scale, so that we can compare the test scores, for 3rd graders in Princeton in 2009 to 8th graders in Philadelphia in 2018. So we can equate across all those things. So underlying the data is something like 430 million standardized test scores. So even for very small districts, we have 10 years of data and 6 grades and 2 subjects. So there's a lot of data even for small districts. There's about 13,000 school districts in the United States. We include all the school districts in this analysis as long as they have at least 20 Black and 20 white students so that we can get an estimate of Black-white gap, or 20 white and 20 Hispanic students, so we get an estimate of. So the analysis has something like 8,000 districts where we have enough data to get a Black-white gap, and 9,000 or 10,000 districts where you have enough data to get a Hispanic-white gap. So it's essentially, it covers something like 95% of all Black students in the country, and similarly for Hispanic students. So the small number of students who are in districts where there's such a small minority of either whites or a minority group that we don't get a gap, but essentially full population data. So the models we're going to fit, I want to say something about this. If you think about a student level model, a kind of education production function models, the economists call it, or a structural model that sort of describes the relationship between test scores and individual and school characteristics. Some model that looks like this top model that says the test score for student I in school S and district D is a function of P, that's the poverty rate in their school. B, that's the percent Black in their school, or percent minority or something. X's, there's individual characteristics, particularly family background characteristics are going to be important. Family socioeconomic status, and then district fixed effects. So think about a simple model like that that says my test score is a function of my family background and some characteristics of my school. Now let's take the average outcome for white students and the average outcome for Black students within a given district. So now I get Y bar, the average test score for white students in district D, and Y bar BD, the average outcome for Black students, just by averaging those, the top equation over Black or white students within a district. And so now I get the average white outcome depends on the average poverty rate in the school of white students, the average proportion Black in the school of white students, the average value of the X's among white students, and the district fixed effect. Same kind of equation for Black students. And now take the difference of them. And the difference of them now is the Black-white test score gap. And that's going to be a function of the Black-white difference in average school poverty rates, the Black-white difference in average school percent Black, and the Black-white difference in average family background characteristics. The district fixed effects fall out of the model. Now, this is a measure of racial segregation. This is the average difference in racial composition of Black and white student schools. So that's racial segregation per se. This is the average difference in poverty rates or free lunch eligibility rates between Black and white student schools. That's a measure of racial economic segregation. And so this equation expresses the gap as a function of two different kinds of segregation and differences in student background characteristics. So it's, and the betas here, assuming the model has no omitted variables and things like that, the betas here are the same betas as from the student level model, but require only aggregate data to be estimated. So we're going to fit models that have this sort of form of this stylized model on the bottom. In the cross-sectional models, we'll have a gap for each district as a function of segregation measures in the district and district level disparities in family background. So the control variables we include as those X's are racial differences in family socioeconomic status. So we have measures from the American Community Survey and the 2000 census at the tabulated at the district level that give us differences in racial median income, racial differences in median income, in percent of parents with a bachelor's degree, in the percent of female-headed households, and SNAP eligibility rates, and unemployment rates, and poverty rates. And I think for the ACS, we also have differences in home ownership and maybe one other measure of SES. So there's a bunch of different measures of socioeconomic status disparities in the model, and we include them from 2000 and from the ACS years in order just to kind of control for as much SES differences as we possibly can. We want to sort of make sure we're eating up as much of the differences that are related to socioeconomic status as possible. Patrick?
So just to clarify, this is a within district measure of segregation. But you kind of made the point that most segregation is between districts.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get it straight in my head. How should we compare it? How should we think about this in relation to Dr. Johnson's measure?
His was also looking at within district segregation. Yeah. So his treatment is the court order, which affects segregation within a school district. And then in his instrumental variable analysis, the instrument, the court order, affects the level of segregation within the district. So his are also a kind of within district analysis. We've also done this same analysis. I'm going to show you the district level analysis today, but we also do it at the metro level, where we can look at between district segregation as well as within district segregation. We find pretty consistent results, so I'm just going to show you the district level analysis. All right, now I've opened up the floodgates to clarifying questions. So we don't want to be unfair to people online, so just ask clarifying questions now, I guess is what I've been told, right?
That's what we try to do.
Yeah.
Just because we end up having more questions at the end than we have time.
Yeah, so are they clarifying, or do you want to hold them for a little later? All right, sorry. I don't mean to be too sparing, but okay, so we control for mostly the main thing we're controlling for is these racial disparities in socioeconomic background, because we want to do that. We also have a bunch of demographic variables, charter school enrollments, and some models we had controls for neighborhood segregation. And in the exploratory analysis, some other measures of school characteristics, which I'll talk about a little bit later. In the panel models, sort of the same setup, except in the panel models, the outcome is the change in the gap from one year to the next within a cohort. So we're looking at how much did the gap change from third to fourth grade, and how is that related to the segregation level that kids experienced in fourth grade, right? So we're controlling for lagged measures of the gap in order to eat up variance and deal with sort of measurement error noise and stuff. And then we have these two measures of segregation, the racial economic and the racial segregation, as well as a smaller set of X's. We don't have socioeconomic data at the sort of year by grade level. So we can't do much to control for that, except for overall kind of racial and poverty composition. But we don't have racial disparities in socioeconomic status. These models have district by year and district by grade fixed effects in them, so they're controlling for any differences in that are stable within a year and district or within a grade and district. So they have a lot of the disparities in socioeconomic status are controlled away by those district year and district grade fixed effects. But if the cohort sort of change socioeconomic disparities from one year to and grade to the next, that would be a confounder in here that we're not controlling for. So before I show you the results, I just want to say something about these two ways of modeling this. I've been thinking about this lately. So the first way that a lot of people would do this is they would fit the first model, take student level data, and you'd regress student level outcomes on individual background and characteristics and school characteristics, and you'd estimate beta P and beta R, which would be the relationship between school composition and test scores. The other way to do it, the way I'm doing it, is taking aggregate data and regressing disparities in outcomes on disparities in covariates and segregation measures. In principle, if the model is correctly specified, you get the same estimates either way. There are statistical reasons why one might be better than the other. If there's measurement error in your X's, you won't control for the X's as well up here as you will down here, because the aggregate X's have most of the measurement error washed out. But the real reason why I like this model a little bit better, and I'm happy to talk more about the differences between these two later if you like, is that this model focuses on the system. The outcomes and the inputs here are features of the educational system. That is segregation and disparities in outcomes. And this is a student level model where the inputs are school level. And so if you want to sort of talk about structural inequality or structural forces, this model actually is about the system of education, whereas this is about kind of individuals and individual schools. And while you can sort of, if correctly specified, get the same information from either one, this one much more directly lets you think about the relationship between systemic factors and this inequality of outcomes. This one doesn't tell you much about inequality per se. You have to then go back and say, well, I know school composition matters, but if school composition isn't really different between two groups, then that doesn't contribute to inequality. So you need sort of extra information to make the first one tell you something about inequality. Whereas this is a model about the production of inequality, whereas this is a model about the production of individual outcomes. And because I'm interested in segregation as the treatment variable, as the structural feature of interest, and the production of inequality of outcomes, this is the model that sort of directly answers that question. The other reason I like this a little bit better is that it may be that segregation matters in ways above and beyond the way it operates strictly through composition. That is, if in segregated systems, resources are distributed differently, and therefore opportunities are distributed differently in ways that are not totally correlated with racial composition or economic composition. This parameter will capture those things. It captures more of the total association of segregation with outcomes, whereas the parameters in this model only capture the part of segregation that operates through composition. And so if the models aren't fully correctly specified, and if some of the mechanisms are omitted, this still captures the things that are related to segregation, whereas this one doesn't necessarily capture them. So I think I'm trying to work on writing up a kind of piece about trying to think about what you learn from different ways of doing this kind of analysis. But in this paper, we're doing this largely for the reasons I said, is because it puts the focus on the education system and the production of inequality as the object of interest, rather than the individual outcome as the object of interest. All right, so let me show you some data and some results. So this is just a simple bivariate relationship. This is racial segregation per se. That is, this is the extent to which Black and white students attend schools with different proportions of minority students. 0 means no segregation. That is, the average white student, the average Black student attend racially identical schools. 0.5, it's very high by this measure. So in the South, when segregation was required by law, it would be 1.0, right? All Black students attend 100% Black schools. All white students attend 0% Black schools. So the maximum value of 1 under the jure segregation. 0.5 is still quite high. It means that the average white and Black students attend schools with 50 percentage points difference. And you can see here, A, there's lots of variation in how much segregation there is. B, the achievement gap varies a lot across places and is quite large in some places. So our metric here is in grade levels. So DC and Atlanta, the achievement gap between white and Black students is 5 grade levels, which is to say the average 8th grade Black student in those places has the same test score as the average 3rd grade white student. So that's enormously high. There's a positive correlation between these two things. The other thing to notice is that even when segregation is 0, the average achievement gap is still like 2 grade levels or so. So segregation is not the only thing driving these patterns. I haven't controlled in this for socioeconomic differences or anything like this. It's scatterplot. But the thing I want to call your attention to is the 5 highlighted districts there. So all of them have segregation levels that are very high, around 0.5, but very different achievement gaps. Detroit has almost no achievement gap. DC and Atlanta have enormous achievement gaps. Racial segregation predicts achievement gaps, but not enormously well. If instead we look at racial economic achievement gaps, so now this is the black-white differences in school poverty rates. So that's our racial economic segregation measure. Again, you see a lot of variation along that measure. The correlation is much higher. And this helps us understand a lot why Detroit has a much lower gap than Washington and Atlanta. Because DC and Atlanta are very racially economically segregated. That is, not only are they racially segregated, but the schools that Black students attend are very high poverty compared to the schools that white students attend. In Detroit, white and Black students attend very different public schools, but all of them are equally high poverty. And so there's no racial economic segregation. In fact, it's negative, meaning that average white student attends a slightly higher poverty school than the average Black student in Detroit. But essentially, no racial economic segregation, even though there's high racial segregation. But DC and Atlanta have high racial segregation and high racial economic segregation. And that's part of why we see this pattern, just in a sort of bivariate sense. If instead of looking at the size of the gap, we look at the growth of the gap. So now the y-axis is how fast the gap grows from one grade to the next as kids progress through school in a district. So 0.1 here means the gap grows by 1/10 of a grade level every year. So in 5 years, from 3rd to 8th grade, the gap gets about a half grade level larger. Again, we see racial segregation is predictive of the growth of the gap, but there's still variation, and you can see the 5 places that I highlighted also differ on that. If we look at racial economic segregation, the correlation is stronger, and we see that that's part of the explanation potentially for why DC and Atlanta have gaps that grow much faster. So well over 0.2 grade levels a year. That is, the gaps are a full grade level larger in 8th grade than in 3rd grade in those places. So this is just to suggest that racial economic segregation may be more important than racial segregation per se. Just now I'll sort of show you this more formally. So these are the cross-sectional models. So we first start with a set of models where we just look at the minority white difference in exposure to minority schoolmates. So that's racial segregation per se. And we look at its relationship to the gap in grade 3 and the growth of the gap. Again, the growth of the gap is the more substantively interesting one here. So in both cases, racial segregation is positively associated with the gap, and the growth of the gap controlling, and all the controls are included in these models. So these are now have the full set of controls in them. When we put in just racial economic segregation, again, it's predictive of both of those things, and more strongly so. And when we put them both in the model, all the work is done by racial economic segregation. So racial segregation per se is not predictive of achievement gap growth. In fact, it's negatively predictive of the overall achievement gaps once we control for racial economic segregation. So the way to think about this is that racial segregation matters, but it matters when it's coupled with racial economic segregation. And then net of racial economic segregation, the racial segregation per se is not predictive. Another way of saying this is it's not the race of one's schoolmates that's predictive of learning, but it's the socioeconomic composition of one school that's predictive of learning. And in the society we live in, those things travel together, right? So when you have a high minority school, it's often a high poverty school, but we have enough data here to distinguish the two of them, despite the fact they're correlated at close to 0.9. So racial segregation and racial economic segregation are very highly correlated, 0.85, 0.9, but there's enough data to distinguish them. And this shows it's the racial economic segregation that's the driving force. For the white Hispanic models, we're going to see similar patterns. Again, racial segregation is predictive of the gaps and the growth of the gap. Racial economic segregation is more so. And when we put them both in, all the work is done by racial economic segregation. And the coefficients on racial segregation per se go to close to 0 and non-significant. So those are the cross-sectional models. The panel models, I'm sorry, these are not the panel models. Can't remember what they are because I've covered up the title. Oh, these are the panel models. Sorry. All right, these are the panel models. That's good. So I was trying to figure out what they might be if they weren't panel models. All right. So there's not going to be any numbers in the top. It's because panel models are only about growth. All right. So racial segregation is predictive of the growth in the panel models. Economic segregation, racial economic segregation is predictive, but more so. And again, when both are in the model, the racial segregation coefficient goes close to 0 and non-significant. Even though they're highly correlated, the standard errors don't blow up. So these are still pretty precisely estimated zeros on the racial segregation coefficients. For the white Hispanic models, we're going to see exactly the same pattern. So in both our cross-sectional models and the panel models, which you leverage different sources of variation. One is sort of between districts and the other is within districts, between grades and years. We're going to see that it's racial economic segregation that's the strong predictor of the growth of achievement gaps, not racial segregation per se. These models also have control for residential segregation, both residential racial segregation and residential racial economic segregation, and all this set of racial disparities and socioeconomic status that we can put in them. All right, so the last thing we do is we do some exploratory analysis to try to figure out what is it when we have highly segregated systems. Is it that the Black schools, what is it about the Black schools and white schools that seem to be driving these differences? And so one possibility is that the schools that Black students attend have less skilled teachers than the schools that white students attend. We know teachers are a strong predictor of learning rates. And so if the schools attended by Black students tend to have less skilled teachers, that may be part of what drives it. We only have 2 measures of teacher skills. They're pretty crude proxies for teacher skill. One is the percentage of teachers in the school who are novice teachers, that is, who are in their first or second year of teaching, and the percent of chronically absent teachers who are absent more than 15 days a year. We also look to see whether or not the curricular offerings of the school matter. So maybe in segregated systems, Black students and Hispanic students have less access to advanced or rigorous coursework. So our proxy for that is the availability of gifted, talented programs in the school. So we're going to look at whether disparities in access to gifted and talented programs are predictive. We're going to look at differences in student-teacher ratios as a proxy for funding differences. We don't have a great measure of funding disparities between schools within districts. In our metro models, we have better funding data because we have funding disparities between districts. But for these district models, student-teacher ratios is going to be our proxy for resources. And another possibility is that the reason why school racial economic segregation matters is because if you attend a high poverty school, that means many of your classmates are from low-income families and come to school with having fewer educational opportunities early in childhood, and so have school readiness levels and prior test scores that are lower than low poverty students on average. And so if I'm a teacher in a school with lots of low achieving students, I'm going to aim my instruction at the modal student who's going to need more remedial education. And so for holding who I am constant, I might get less rigorous or advanced instruction if my peers have lower prior achievement. So it's a kind of a peer effect, but one that operates not because something rubs off from the kid next to me, right? But it operates because if all the kids next to me are low income, then on average their test scores coming in are lower. And that's going to change what the teacher does in the classroom, and that's going to affect my learning rate. So it's a kind of a roundabout peer effect story. So what we're going to do is put in a model that says how different are the prior year's test scores of my peers between the average black and white student in the district to kind of.
Just to point out, we're almost at the.
Yep, this is my last result slide, so good time. So here's what we see. So we have the two segregation measures in there. And none of these, first thing to notice is that they don't change the coefficient on racial economic segregation at all. If anything, they make it slightly larger. That is, we're looking for things to reduce that, to explain that. They don't do that. The teacher measures do predict. So when there are disparities in exposure to novice teachers or absent teachers, that does affect the achievement gap. But those measures aren't that highly correlated with racial economic segregation, and so therefore don't do a lot to explain that. The other measures do nothing. And so we're sort of left with a bit of a puzzle. That is, it's clear that racial economic segregation is predictive of the achievement gaps and the growth of achievement gaps. B, it's clear that that operates through racial economic segregation. But C, it's not clear what the mechanism by which racial economic segregation leads to the growth of achievement gaps. At least none of the things we have reasonable proxies for is able to explain away any of that effect. And so I won't belabor that point. So I don't think you should think of this as pure effects, except in the sort of story I told, stories like that. It may be things we can't measure or haven't figured out how to measure yet, like high poverty schools have parents with less social capital, less political capital, less economic capital, less ways to kind of help the school. And so there's a lot of literature about how parental social capital and political capital can be beneficial for schools. We don't have a good measure of it. Maybe that's part of the story. Maybe our teacher measures are just too noisy to capture some of those things. We're going to be using data from some other data sources to try to get a better handle on the teacher questions. But I'm open also to other thoughts you have about, I mean, this puzzle we sort of end with, which is, it's so clear that there's this strong relationship between racial economic segregation and achievement gaps, but we can't identify any real evidence of the mechanism through which that operates. So with that, I think we have 10 minutes for questions.